All right, and Gil, go ahead and kick us off.
Um, okay. It's my pleasure to welcome you and welcome Frank Young to the program, who is the author of the book, 17 Aerogrammes, A Passage to India. And I've read it, and it is a marvelous, marvelous book. I highly recommend it. My name is Gil Shedler. I was part of the charter faculty at Callison College. I also spent the same year in India as Frank, and I was a lecturer in American literature at the University of Bangalore and did a lot of the Fulbright lecturing. I was transferred after Callison was phased out to the English department and religious studies department. I taught for 38 years at University of Pacific, and I've been retired for 17 years and now live in a retirement community, O'Connor Woods in North Stockton. And I'd like to thank everybody for joining today's event, and especially Dr. Frank Young, 1972 Callison grad and the author of the book that we mentioned, 47 Aerogrammes, A Passage Through India, a book dealing with his year studying in India with Pacific's Callison College. So we join him for a virtual lunch discussion to hear more about how living in a non-Western culture changed his life. Frank, would you please introduce yourself?
Well, thank you, Gil. Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. And while I can't see everyone, I'm aware that so many of our good friends and fellow alums from Callison, from whatever year, Bangalore's 1, 2, 3, or 4, are here on the Zoom virtual luncheon, and I'm so happy that you could join. I don't know how many of you have kept up with my background, but shortly after I left Callison, I went to work for our local congressman who represented Stockton, California, John McFall. And I worked for him until I entered graduate school at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, where building on my year in India with Callison, I spent a year in Taiwan doing doctoral research for the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. After that, I started a long career with the Foreign Service, with the U.S. Agency for International Development, served in the Philippines, India, Bangladesh, Ghana is my final posting, where I was USAID director. I retired in 2005 after having been awarded the Distinguished Career Service Award by the agency, and thought I was going to just kind of ease gently into retirement, and went to work for the private sector actually for a few years until USAID called me back into the agency to be their assistant administrator for Asia, which I did until I left in 2014 and segued myself and my family, my wife Pat and I, down here to Sarasota, Florida, which is not what you see in the background. This is the Golden Gate Bridge, but I'm actually in Sarasota, Florida on the Gulf Coast, and we do see the sun set in the west. So that's kind of briefly what I've been up to. Here in retirement, I'm chair of the board of the Foreign Service Retirees Association here in Florida, which is the largest statewide association of retired Foreign Service officers in the United States. So I'm continuing the work that has sort of been my life, which is devoted to international affairs, international studies, and the like. Gil, I thought I might kick off by talking a bit about why I wrote this book.
Exactly. That's what we want to hear.
Yeah.
What inspired you to write this book?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I realized that although there had been a lot of oral histories of Callison and the cluster colleges given primarily by the faculty, and I think, Gil, you did one yourself, And Phil Gilbertson wrote a beautiful history of Pacific that also included a brief history of Callison. Nobody had published an account of that year in India, particularly from the student point of view. And I thought that it begged to be done somehow. And but I really couldn't get traction on it until 2011. And I guess the real impetus to write the book took shape when I went back to New Delhi in 2011 as the acting aid director for the USAID mission in India. And I describe in the book my arrival on a steamy, early July night. And believe me, July is not the month you want to go to Delhi. Any of you who remember the place. Walking into Indira Gandhi Airport, such a spacious, gorgeous, modern airport. I was just floored by the high ceilings and the broad corridors and how quiet and orderly it was. An airport that I might have expected to encounter anywhere in Europe. And getting through customs with nary a nod from the customs officer, quite a different scene from what we experienced in Calcutta in September of 1969. And walking out of the customs hall into the air and meeting the USAID staff who had come to meet me that night and piled me into a mission car and took me to my residence where I'd be living for the next several months on Amrita Shergill Marg, just across from Lodi Gardens in Delhi. And driving in from the airport, it was the sights, the smells, the rhythm of the traffic. As we turned up the road toward Humayun's tomb, I saw a camel walking down the road. We weaved on the dual carriageway to avoid the cows that were sitting in the middle of the road at midnight. And it just all flooded back. It just overwhelmed me with a kind of like a tsunami wave of emotion. And I almost felt like I'd come home again. I felt at home immediately, like I'd never left. And that's when I realized that I just had to dust off a 40-year-old manuscript that I'd written just after I'd come back from India. Just sort of spilled my guts on the page at that point. But I had to dust that off and try to see if I could rewrite what that year was about and make it relatable to people who might read it. As I tried to do that, though, I realized something was missing in the narrative. And what was missing was my real voice. And I found that voice in a hat box in my mother's closet. And what was in that hat box was all the letters, the 47 aerogrammes that Gil referred to, that I had written home during that year in India. My mother had saved them. She'd arranged them in chronological order, and she carefully bound them with rubber bands and hidden them in a dark corner of her closet so the ink wouldn't fade. In reading those aerogrammes, I'd found the connective tissue for my narrative, and I finally got to work. And the process of rewriting, frankly, it took about 21 drafts over 10 years, including 5 years just to come up with the darn title. And I kept going back and forth on titles. I kept moving back to a title of the Shilton Diaries, and I felt that really wasn't going to work. And I just finally went with the simplicity of it, which was 47 aerogrammes. And my wife, Pat, and our kids, Alex and Andrea, who were just incredibly patient and supportive, even if I was skeptical if that would ever be finished. But I had to get from the point of finishing a draft and finding a publisher. And I was kind of stuck right there. I really wasn't ready to push it out into the world. And it wasn't until Randy Barton Boyer and Chris Seche recruited me to be part of the Callison SIS Study Room fundraiser that I rediscovered the true year of the true meaning of what that year in India meant. And that's what really pushed me over the finish line to line up a publisher and struggle through 8 more copy edits. So if there's a lesson in all of this, everyone, if anyone ever thinks they want to do something like this, writing a memoir is not for the faint of heart. It's a cathartic process where you often discover things that you didn't expect to discover.
Well, thanks for that, Frank. I wonder if you would go on and talk about some of the stories in the book. Some of the stories that really fascinated me is all the weekend travel that you did, and the Jain celebration you attended in Hyderabad with one of the professors, and your homestay was movingly talked about. And your final paper on communism in India fascinated me, and the research you did in Kerala and in Bengal. But I don't want to describe what you talk about, but back to some of the stories that you'd like to share with your friends.
Well, thanks, Gil. For those who haven't read it, I won't give too much away, and those who have read it, you'll know kind of what I'm talking about. The book is a collection of stories, but it's also a grand story. And I think the grand story is one of a transformation that I went through a year's encounter with an environment, a country, and a culture so drastically opposite from my own. One of the stories it starts with is my own backstory, coming from a small, at that time, semi-rural agricultural town in Modesto, California, which was George Lucas's archetype for the movie American Graffiti, if you remember that movie. And the story of why I chose Callison when my parents and friends were all pushing me to apply to Ivy League schools or apply to Stanford. And I actually chose Callison over Stanford and Brown. And of course, a debating scholarship from the speech department at Pacific didn't hurt. It really helped. But that story is one story. Why did I decide to do that? And, you know, to this day, if I go back and try to go through my reasoning, it was just sort of, I was so desperate to get out of Modesto that I figured, you know, Palo Alto was just too close. I ended up in Stockton, but I knew I was going to India. And that was sort of the excitement of it all. It was such a dramatic change from the sort of standard 4-year liberal arts curriculum that I just felt it was something I had to do. As you mentioned, Gil, it's also a story laced together with many adventures and encounters, a lot of them quite embarrassing, such as the time that a couple of friends and I ended up in Mysore and we crashed the durbar of the Maharaja of Mysore on the last year that they did the Dussehra celebrations there. We all spent about $14 and rented these absolutely ludicrous costumes, and were escorted up to the Maharaja's durbar, where we sat around with a bunch of other people, the only 3 white faces in the entire group, feeling embarrassed the whole time, sitting through 6 incredibly hot hours with nothing to eat or drink but really bad tea. And we couldn't believe we'd done that. And we thought we were going to get arrested, but we didn't. It was something that kind of blew our minds. But there were a number of other stories loaded with what I would call linguistic and behavioral faux pas, where I guess chance often favored me and strangers always seemed to be there to help. And there was always an open road and an open bus ticket, which were the pathways to those adventures. There was one in Kerala, and it's a short passage, and I could just read through it very quickly, where I realized if you didn't say things in a way that the person on the other end could understand them, the outcome was not likely to be a favorable one. And it talks about when in Aleppo, the young lady and I was traveling with, we were trying to get something to eat. And we went into a restaurant, a little bhavan at the end of an alley. And we found a place. The waiter didn't speak much English and generally responded to everything we asked about by saying yes, 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 yes. And so we decided to point to the menu items that we wanted. So I said, we will have the chicken curry with rice. Not having, Saab. All right, how about the fish curry? I asked, pointing to the item. Not having. Mutton curry, vegetable curry? Sorry, not having. So I closed the menu, laid it on the table in frustration. What do you have? We have rice and tomatoes with some curry. Well, that dish wasn't on the menu. Okay, bring us 2 plates of that, but make it not hot. Well, the waiter gave us a very puzzled look, but tilted and swiveled his head side to side in the gesture that we now knew meant yes. 2 hours passed. We still had no food. Well, perhaps they'd run out of rice, tomatoes, and the spices for curry while we discussed the long list of what the restaurant did not have. After all, Aleppo was not a prosperous town, and Kerala had not had a particularly good harvest that year. So just as we were about to depart, frustrated, heading for the Coke stand that also sold parlay biscuits, our waiter showed up with 2 plates containing a generous serving of rice, curry, and tomatoes on the side. Well, we eagerly took our first bites and looked at each other, half astonished, half amused. The curry was the hottest this side of hell, and the rice was stone cold. We asked the waiter for an explanation. You said not hot. After we cook the rice, we are cooling it down to become cold the way you asked, sir. He said, sir. He was frustrated too. I mean, there were a number of other examples of things like that happened that embarrassed us, but taught us a great deal. There's also the story, as you mentioned, Gil, about looking at Indian poverty. And Indian poverty was something that frustrated me. I couldn't understand how a country could embrace democracy and yet have such a large part of its population living below the poverty line. And as part of my term paper in India, I struggled with the topic of why the Indians and Indian society would choose democracy over communism, and why communism wouldn't necessarily be the alternative that might provide the answer. And in the process of doing that, and doing that paper, I learned a lot about what made up Indian politics and what makes up the values that they embraced as a society that made them a fundamentally democratic society. It's also the story, there are stories of cities in the book. It's a story of Calcutta and how it traumatized me horribly in September when we first arrived, but how it captivated me the following February when I returned. It's also the story of Bangalore and how I made it home. And as you mentioned, Gil, it's the story of love, of being embraced by an Indian family and being allowed into the intimacy and rhythm of their daily lives, such as being the eldest male in the household, having to oversee the dowry bargaining of my Indian sister, where we debated her value in terms of motor scooters and goats. And of course, the crushing emotional blow that I felt when I learned of my Indian father's death when I returned to their home unannounced 5 years later. And of course, all of these stories add up to the real story of culture shock, both forward and reverse, where I discovered explaining what it was like during that year in India to family and friends became an exercise in seeking but failing to find that 30-second elevator speech that kind of made it all make sense. And for those of you that went through the Bangalore experience, I know you can identify with this. People would ask you, how did you find India? And I got to the point where my only answer was, well, I went to San Francisco and turned left, because I just simply couldn't come up with anything more profound that would hold their attention. So, in a sense, this is my story. And in a way, I think it's the story of the Callison education that my classmates and I received outside the walls of the Shilton Hotel. Now, I'm very careful to say that this book does not reflect the experience of my classmates, because I wouldn't dare speak in their voice or try to speak in their voice. but those who have read it have told me how much a lot of what's in there resonates with them. I would add, Gil, and I thought about this a lot last night, that if I had to boil all these stories down into three themes that run through the book, they might be how living in another culture transforms how you view your own, the struggle to adapt, understand, and respect what you can't quite grasp, and how that experience is an education of a special sort. It keeps educating you for the rest of your life. The last story I'd like to leave you with is toward the end of the book, I talk about the collective hope that our Bangalore 2 class had, that we talked about on our last night in India. And it was the hope that we took away the best of India's essence while leaving behind the best of ours. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read a short passage from near the end of the book that sums up the conversation that our class had that last evening in India, April 29th, 1970, in the dining room of the Ashoka Hotel in Delhi. Today is April 30th, and India is already a part of my past. On the bus to the airport for the flight to Moscow, the searing heat of the Delhi spring was perversely welcome, as it gave me something else to think about other than the anxiety of returning home. On one level, I know what I'm going back to, yet I have little idea of what I really will face when I reunite with family and friends. This fills me with dread. I still recall those first few days in India last September, when the sense of discovery and adventure filled me with energy and optimism. None of us in the class now known as Bangalore 2 knew what each new day would bring, but the unknowing filled us with courage and enthusiasm and a bit of recklessness. Last night, most of us gathered for dinner in the cavernous dining room of the Ashoka Hotel in Chanakyapuri, New Delhi's diplomatic enclave. We talked about why we had put ourselves through all of this and what it all meant. Remembering that scorching hot day at Stockton Airport the prior August, I wondered who among us felt that our India experience had met the expectations we demanded of it. What bonded us as a class and what served as our collective strength was that we believed that this year in India would change our lives forever. And there was the belief, really hope, that we had also changed the impression that Indians have of Americans, showing them who we are as a people. Perhaps this was a bit of hubris on our part, reflecting the mindset of a generation that was already reshaping America. We did not just travel to India, but we journeyed through India, believing we would take what we needed from the experience and leave behind the best of what we had to offer. As much as we tried to embrace the experience for all its mystery and ambiguity, the prism of our Americanness would govern what we took in and gave back. It would refract the essence of who we were as individuals, so that the Indians we encountered would see us with a clearer and more benign vision. For some of us, our personal India was fundamentally a spiritual awakening. For others, it was an existential test of physical and emotional survival. And for still others, it became a day-to-day exercise in figuring out why one would go through this experience in the first place. We were done with India, but India was not done with us.
Well, thank you for that, Frank. You have touched a little bit on this third theme that we wanted to talk about, but maybe you can address in more detail. What do you hope your readers will get out of this book?
Well, it's funny, when I started writing it over 10 years ago, I really didn't think about the impact. I didn't think of how others might receive it. And I guess I probably should have, because as I look back on it now, different people will take different things away. The responses I've gotten from my fellow alums from the Callison classes are very different from the responses and reactions I've gotten from friends and colleagues, say in the Foreign Service, or even from my neighbors who live around the corner from me here in Sarasota. Everyone took something different away from the book, and I guess for me that's the most valuable thing to get as feedback. But if I think in more broader terms, I I really want to get the word out and publicize the value of study abroad. Uh, it I know over the past decade or two, the idea of study abroad it's become less and less popular for some reason. It's not something that is pushed or even embraced as aggressively as, say, it was 40, 50 years ago, particularly when Callison was rolling out its model. And in the process of doing that, I want to expose readers who don't know Callison to the Callison model, which I think still can work today in various bits and pieces. For students who might have the opportunity to read this and contemplating a major in global affairs or international studies, I hope it would help them understand the value of study abroad and intensive exposure to another culture. How such an experience is transformative and creates young adults who are resilient in the face of challenge. Frankly, I think students in most majors could really benefit from such an experience of study abroad. It just doesn't have to be someone in global affairs or international studies. And it's something I hope that colleges and universities will start investing in again and create long-term opportunities for students to have this kind of experience. And I really sort of direct that message to Pacific in particular. I hope the future for international studies and global affairs, or whatever you might call it, Pacific, will be a bright one going forward. Second, as I was thinking about the issue of impact, I thought about the issues that our world is facing today. And I don't care if it's climate change or health pandemics or conflict, peace, poverty reduction, and the list goes on. There isn't a single major problem in the world today that can be solved by only one country or within one culture. These issues don't respect borders. They're transnational, they're all cross-cultural and transnational in nature, and those are the kinds of solutions that they demand. And for that reason, too, I hope that students and parents who might read this book will be persuaded of the value of this type of education, because it teaches us how to view the world through the lens of another society and culture. And in essence, I think that's the way we're going to really solve some of these global issues. And finally, to get down to practical terms, study and work abroad really looks good on a CV. Employers, if given the choice of hiring someone with a study abroad experience versus someone without it, they're more likely to choose the former. And I've heard that constantly from employers. In my own case, I was told by the Dean of Admissions at the Fletcher School that my admission to the Fletcher School was actually a toss-up. The admissions committee was split down the middle. And it was my year in India that actually secured my admission to that school. So, I guess the return on this investment can be pretty great. So, those are the kinds of things I'd say with respect to the impact side.
Well said, and I'm proud that my daughter, who went to Brown, did her junior year in India, and has said that year had such a great impact on her, as did my year in India. So that's great. Chris, do you want to pick up now and interact with people who might have some questions?
Yes, indeed. All right. So now is the time that we will let you all be able to unmute yourselves, ask questions, say hello. I know many of you have studied abroad, have experiences yourselves. If you use the reaction button down at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand, then we can figure out an order. If that's a little bit difficult, just kind of wave your hand around on the screen, and Monica and I will try to see you, and I will call on you to unmute yourself, and then you can go ahead and ask your question. All right, so Kathleen Wheeler.
Hello, Frank.
Kathy, hi.
I just want to say I am so glad you wrote this book. I'm about 2/3 of the way through it, and it's been delightful how it's unearthed so many memories that I had forgotten all about. It was just like reliving the year. And I think you succeeded in the objectives that you laid out around what you hope the reader will get, and conveying the value of a year abroad. I wish everyone could have a year abroad. It was for me a transformative year as well. And the effect has lasted throughout my life. So I just wanted to reinforce that point. Gil Shedler, it's lovely to see you. I have such fond memories of you. And Randy Barton, I remember you. So I just wanted to say hello to everyone and say kudos to you, Frank, for what a magnificent accomplishment.
Thank you. Thanks, Kathy.
Right, Teresa Selwell. Oh, we have you muted. Sorry about that.
There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Frank, I enjoyed your presentation, and I heartily support the idea of studying abroad. I'm a Cobeliana from 1977, and I had the opportunity.
Oh, no. What happened?
And I had the opportunity to do my student teaching in Mexico City. And I liked it so well that, especially when I got hired by the American school there, I went back and stayed 4 years in Mexico City, and later went on to Puerto Rico for 2.5 years. And there's nothing like living and working, or in your case, studying abroad. So I too hope that it will become revived in the university culture, especially now as COVID is diminishing, that people will seriously consider going overseas. It's such a broadening experience in so many ways. And some of the friends that I made while I was working and living in Mexico, I still have to this day. So I commend you for your book. It piques my interest and kind of makes me thinking about maybe I should write something about my life and in Latin America. So thanks, Frank.
Thank you, Teresa. And you and Kathy both, I think both your comments point to one thing that I'm glad came out, which is what you take away from that experience builds and grows throughout your lifetime. And no matter what stage of life you pass through, early professional, mid-professional, retirement, second act, third act, this is something that stays with you, and the transformation continues. I don't think it ever really stops. And Teresa, you point out something that I want to give a shout out to, not just to the India classes, but the classes that went to Japan, that had a really rare and unique experience there. And as I read what they write on the Callison Facebook page, their experiences were just so remarkable and equally as valuable as what we went through in India. Taiwan, Mexico, all of us in those various countries and classes, and Latin America, as you mentioned, Teresa, we all took away something extremely valuable from all of those experiences, and it continues to have impact. I think some of you probably noted as I was talking earlier, there were times when my voice broke because there are memories that I still have that are very strong and very visceral. And that's why, in a sense, writing the book was so cathartic, but also so emotional. And why it just took this long. I'm glad I didn't try to push this through in the first 10 years or so after I came back. It took a long time to make sense of what that year was like and what impact it had. So thank you both very much for your comments.
All right, wonderful. We have Rhonda, I believe Rhonda next, and then Craig after that.
And are you unmuting me? Okay.
You are unmuted. Yep.
Okay. I just want to say aloha from Honolulu. I'm actually a Raymond grad, not a Callison grad. And I didn't start till 1973. So I don't think I've met most of you. Anyway, I wanted to join in on this because I took a Rhodes Scholar trip to India in the fall of 2018 and sort of wanted to hear what you had to say about it, Frank. The question I have for you, Frank, is about, do you think that this experience that you had in the year you were studying there prepared you for the poverty you saw later in Bangladesh and Ghana?
That's a really good question. And, you know, my first response, and of course, I went back to India in the early 80s to serve at the mission there. Well, first of all, I don't think I could have ever entered the development profession had I not gone to India. You know, poverty was something I encountered on the, you know, inside the pages of Time magazine or National Geographic or what have you, but I never came in you know, sort of in close quarters with it until I got to India, and it threw me. When you live in Modesto, California, you're like, just about anything outside that city that little town is gonna throw you. And this really threw me, but it threw me in the way that I didn't expect. And it was the inability to answer the question, why? Why is this happening? What are the choices that are being made by the government, by society itself, that allows this to happen? And I kept thinking that it was being allowed to happen without realizing that there were other factors in play that sometimes meant that it happened without people being able to make the choice of being able to better their lives. When I came out of India, my desire to work in the development profession was really to work at trying to find solutions and work on solutions for bettering the lives of people in countries that were less prosperous than our own. And the thing I learned in all my tours is the poverty in Bangladesh is different from the poverty in India, and it's different from the poverty in Ghana. I can't put all three countries, or even the poverty in the Philippines, where I served, I can't put them all in the same sphere because they all have their unique roots, the unique characteristics that define them, but they all seem to come out of one common source. And that's lack of opportunity, lack of access to capital, to markets, to education, to health. Education and health in particular are really the basics. And I guess I learned that by the time I got to my final tour in Ghana, that unless we invest in people, no matter what structure we set up, it's going to be very difficult for them to be part of the market and succeed in society. The other thing I learned is that democracy and prosperity aren't necessarily causally linked. A country can be prosperous without necessarily having to have a fully functioning democracy, and a fully functioning democracy is not necessarily necessary, nor is it sufficient for a society to become prosperous. The two will converge, or may well converge at some point. But it wasn't the model or the image that I had when I was in India. And India broke a lot of those stereotypes for me. And it taught me, I guess, how to view the issue of poverty differently depending on the country I was in. And the first thing I had to do in terms of understanding why poverty persisted in a given country is to understand the country's history, its values, its culture, what creates obstacles for some groups to move up in society and up the social and economic ladder, and what are the factors that mitigate against it. And a lot of it comes down to understanding what's going on in a country through the lens of that country's values and culture. And I guess that's what India taught me that I needed to do. And believe me, it's a challenge. When we Americans go into a country, we bring our own solutions with us. And I think what we've learned over time is that we need to do a lot more listening and a lot more observing before we start working with the people in a given country on a solution. Just to finish off, the two projects that I worked on during my development career that were the most successful were the ones that the country I was in came up with. It was their idea, not ours. And it was them, in this case, India with the Integrated Child Development Services Program, and Ghana with the West Africa Gas Pipeline. It was their idea. And they asked us for help. And they were great programs to work on, and they were the most successful I ever worked with.
That's really interesting. And then I just have an aside, a question for you. I don't know if you ever crossed paths with Andy Key.
Yeah, I know Andy.
Well, for those of you who don't know, he passed away on March 30th.
Oh, no. I'm sorry.
So I remained very close to Andy because I had a lot of contact with him over the years after, as his career developed at United States Information Agency. And after he retired to Boulder, Colorado, which is where I lived until I lived there until 2012. So been close contact and made trips back and seen him many times. So I thought you might have crossed paths with him. Did you cross paths with him in Bangladesh?
I think it may have been, yeah.
And because they were there for quite a while. So.
I was there for 6 years. Nobody goes to Bangladesh for 6 years.
Right.
But I was so fortunate. My wife, Pat, had a diplomatic assignment there as well in the Canadian High Commission. In fact, she outranked me, which was great. I got to ride sometimes in the Canadian High Commissioner's flag car, and that was so much fun. But we stayed there for 6 years. The work was interesting. The community was wonderful. But it was really important work, and we felt like we were doing something right. Henry Kissinger famously called it the basket case. And I can tell you, from the 6 years I was there, it is anything but a basket case. A country that suffered famine in 1941 and lost something like 50, well, not 50, about 5 million people due to starvation. By the time I left Bangladesh, they were exporting rice. A great success story, and one of their own making, but with a lot of donor help.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for teasing out those stories. That's always wonderful to hear. Craig, you are up next. Go ahead and unmute yourself, and we will let you ask your question.
Okay, it's not so much a question as two quick comments. One is that as far as the cultural differences and the impact, I was in Covell. I graduated in '73, so I was there the same time you were. But I didn't know you because Covell people didn't know Callison people.
That's right.
We were completely separated. I don't know whether that was the fault of the school's administration or just our cultures, but I didn't get to know Callison people until a few years later when I started doing stuff with Wendy and Chris, and some other stuff I've been involved in. But that's kind of an example. The other thing is that as far as the impact, Covell's been a major part of my life. I am talking to you right now from 10,000 feet in the Andes Mountains of Ecuador, where I live.
Fantastic.
And I am not Ecuadorian. I am not American. I am Covelliano.
Yeah.
And that I really mean that. It may sound like over the top, but I'm a Covellian. It has impacted my life in so many ways, not necessarily my professional career, but all the rest of my life.
Right.
And I'm so much that experience had such an impact. We went to Costa Rica, but it didn't matter. We had our people from every country, with us there.
Yeah.
So now I'm going to try and get a hold of your book, but is it on Amazon by any chance?
Yes, it is on Amazon. In fact, it's believe it or not, it's Amazon US Canada, UK. I even found it on Amazon Netherlands, English translation.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't know about Latin America. I really
Yeah,
don't.
I don't know if it's downloadable, but
It is. It's available on e-format.
Kindle?
Okay,
Kindle,
cool.
yes.
Then I will definitely get it.
Yeah.
All right, well, great. It's I got to take off for another meeting right now, but
Okay.
this has
Thanks
been
for
great.
joining,
I love
Craig.
seeing this stuff happen.
Say goodbye to her.
Okay. Goodbye, everybody. I'll see you
Bye,
later.
Craig. Thanks.
Okay.
All right. Thank you for joining us today. Dr. Herring, you have your hand up if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Chris. First of all, to everyone I know, it's great to see you. Frank, it's great to see you, and it's great to listen to you. First of all, also apologies for being late. I was in class till 12:15. I mentioned this to Frank. I just couldn't get away any sooner. But I just wanted to say how pleasant it is for me to hear a reaffirmation of the importance of international education and how any of these wicked problems, as we like to call them these days, that the world faces cannot be solved without a global focus on them. These things are so important, and I think, unfortunately, lacking a little bit across most universities, including this one right now. So it's just nice to hear a reaffirmation of the importance of this stuff. And for a selfish reason, it made my day. So thanks, Frank, and everyone else.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks. Hearing Craig and you, Bill, it makes me realize that the depth of this experience really does go beyond what it does for you professionally. And it's so important for the return on investment for universities who can invest in this kind of education to really rededicate themselves to do it. I know the market out there is thin. And, students, it's hard to gin up the enthusiasm in new students to want to do this kind of program and go abroad like this. Maybe it's marketing, I don't know, but there's got to be a way to reach future students or prospective students with an opportunity like this, because the world is moving in a direction where it's going to need more of this skill set, not less. And we've got to find a way to invest in it. Just simply have to find a way.
Very good.
More.
All right. I saw Wendy Case had her hand up.
Thank you, Chris. I just wanted to say to follow on with Craig Carruthers' comment that in the last year, for a variety of reasons, I've had the opportunity to get to know more Covillanos and Raymond grads than I ever knew on campus. I think because of the way the quad system was set up and the dining rooms. But one of the many interesting things I've learned from the Covillanos is that they had 4 years in a foreign country. That really was culture shock for them.
Yeah.
And it was the first time I thought, oh, it was weird to be in Stockton for 4 years. So I think it's interesting that Craig ended up moving to Ecuador with his wife, and also that the Covillanos went through their own version of culture shock, and it wasn't just for 6 months or a year, it was 4 years. So I just wanted to pipe in and say it's really fun to meet everybody now from all the cluster colleges for the first time.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. I think the cluster college system, I think President Burns had a great vision. The problem was we were pretty much stovepiped as the 3 schools, Raymond, Callison, Covell. We were each going in our own directions. And of course, we were, all 3 of us, a lot of it stovepiped off from COP and from the rest of the university, which didn't help either. The only reason I knew anybody from Raymond was one of my high school, fellow high school graduates from Davis High in '68 was a Raymond student. So he and I got together frequently. And being on the debate squad, I was able to meet a lot of students from COP. So I was able to get out. But we really were stovepiped as a group of colleges. And I think now in retrospect, we could have learned a lot from each other by sort of cross communication, even cross fertilizing our curriculum might have helped a bit. But that's then and this is now.
All right. Looking at the time, we might have time for maybe one or two more questions or comments if anyone wants. I'm looking around to see. Oh, Barry Harper has his hand up.
Thank you, Frank. I also would be interested in your book, finding a way to get it. I graduated from the business school in '66. So I never got a chance to do an abroad program through the university. But in my business career, I've visited over 40 countries on 6 continents doing business with different people in those countries. And the culture aspect of it is certainly very important. Never had the opportunity to deep dive into it where you live in the culture, but I also serve on the advisory board for the business school now. And there is at least one professor who is taking a group of students to Europe for a 2-week class where they're going to be tied into the wine industry, learning about the wine industry in France, and then bringing that back to the US. So hopefully, like you, I'd like to see more opportunities for the current students to get that exposure, because in the real business world or academia or public service, getting into countries and understanding the people is really a key. Thank you.
Yeah, Barry, thanks so much for that. And it's interesting, when I was serving on the advisory board for the School of International Studies, one of the things we talked about was trying to reach out to students in the business school to try and create study abroad opportunities for them. Because if there's any other school that I can think of that would really, really benefit from a study abroad experience, would be in the business school. And I think you've got your finger right on it. And in terms of getting the book, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, even in your independent bookstore can order it through bookstore.org if you want to support your independent bookstore, which is what my family likes to do.
Just one further comment. I just remembered the dean of the business school when I was there was a gentleman from Argentina. And one of the things that was required under the catalog that I entered is we had to have a proficiency in a foreign language, just because he thought that was important, which I thought was an interesting twist for a business major.
Yeah, interesting.
All right, so it looks time-wise, I'm gonna wrap up the questions. And
Chris, can I say one thing? I just saw a note from Terry Tutapali pop up. Well, this session on YouTube, for those unable to join us today, Pat and Larry Meredith had computer problems. I'd love for Pat and Larry to see it. And I think the answer is yes, Chris. But Terry, I'd like to give a shout out to you. Thank you for joining us. I just read your text message before coming on, and I'll send you a private message back. You caught something that the copy editors didn't catch. So thank you very much.
All right, so go ahead. If you would like to unmute yourself, Terry, you can go ahead and do that. Let's try one more time. Still muted.
Is it okay now?
There we go.
There you are.
All right, sorry. I just wanted to say that I really admired you for writing the book. Many of us who have traveled abroad or been with Callison and shared stories over all these years have said so many times we need to write a book. And it takes so much effort and it seems so overwhelming. And I really like the way you divided things up. I think those aerograms set you off in the right direction.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Terry. And yeah, as I said, this thing ain't for the faint of heart. It's a tough slog, and you really have to be in it for the long term. And I guess if I had only one book in my life, I'm glad it was this one.
Yeah. All right. So Gil, if you'd like to wrap it up and ask any final question or comments to Frank, and then we will let him make his final comments, so that way we can respect everyone's time and end right around 1. Let's get you unmuted there.
I would just like to thank all of the people who participated and listened and asked very good questions. And special thanks again to Frank for all that you put into this book. And I know it was a great task, and it's an excellent read. And thanks to all of you again.
Thank you, Gil and Chris, for organizing this. And thank you, everyone, for joining. And I so welcome being able to share this again with my Callison colleagues, as well as my colleagues from Raymond and Cavell and others who are out there. So thank you for joining. And Chris, back over to you.
All right, wonderful. We will have this up so that way everyone can watch this later, send it out. Let's just give a round of applause to Frank and Gil. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a wonderful week. And hopefully we will see you all in virtually and hopefully in person sometime soon.
Thank you.